Chapter 5 covers coding summary queries. We are in week 2, and we are still reviewing querying. Here are the objectives of this module. Aggregate functions are pretty easy. By default, all values are included in the calculation regardless of whether they're duplicated. If you want to omit duplicate values, code the distinct keyword. This is usually only used with the count function. All of the aggregate functions except for count star ignore null values. This example counts the number of unpaid invoices and calculates the total due. We know it's an unpaid invoice with this calculation. So this is the amount that we've billed the customer. This is the amount the customer has paid us. And this is the amount of credit we're giving the customer. So you're going to see this calculation quite a bit in this course. So we select the count star as number of invoices, and then we sum the amount that is due. And this is for all the customers where we have some money that's due us. Here we're using different aggregate functions, the average and sum. And interestingly, in this select statement, we create a literal or a constant. It's just going to be called after 9/1/2015. And then we count the number of invoices, then we average the invoice total, and then we sum the invoice total. And here we're using min and max. So most of the aggregate functions also work with non-numeric columns. Average and sum are ones that only work with numeric columns. In this example, minimum vendor name returns the first alphabetical name, while max vendor name returns the last alphabetical name. If you want to count only the rows with unique values in a specified column, you can code the count function with the distinct keyword followed by the name of the column. Grouping and summarizing essentially lets you include and filter on subtotals in your queries. Here's the syntax for group by and halving. A key thing to remember is you group by the non-aggregate value in the select statement. In this example, we group by vendor ID. That's the non-aggregated value. Another way to think of group by is creating subtotals. In this example of a query joining two tables, we have two non-aggregated fields, vendor state and vendor city, in the select statement, so we have to include those in the group by. This query adds a halving clause, which is just a filter on an aggregate function. You use where to filter on non-aggregate values before rows are grouped, but you use halving to filter after rows are grouped. A where clause cannot contain aggregate functions. In this example, average invoice total is an aggregate function, so if we want to filter on it, we have to use halving. Remember that halving is optional. It's only if you want to filter on the aggregated value. And in this example, invoice total is just a field in a table, so we can filter on it in the where clause. Interestingly, you can include non-aggregated values in the having clause. This example has invoice date in the having clause. And this query returns the same results set as the last query, but we filter on invoice date in the where clause. Typically, it's going to be more efficient for you to do your filter in the where clause on non-aggregated values than if you were to include them in the having clause. There are a few interesting SQL Server extensions that you should also know about. The rollup operator adds a summary row for each group specified. It also adds a summary row to the end of the result set that summarizes the entire result set. If the group by clause specifies a single group, only the final summary row is added. So here we see the rollup operator adds a summary row for each group specified. And if the group by clause specifies just a single group, then you're only going to get the final summary row, just as we saw in this query. If we had multiple fields in our group by, we would see multiple subtotals. The sort sequence in the order by clause is applied after the summary rows are added, which makes sense. Order by is the last clause in the query. Because of that, you will want to sort grouping columns in descending order so that the summary row for each group appears after the other rows in the group. It just seems, it makes the result set clearer. That only applies if you're using the roll-up where you're creating these extra subtotals. And there's different syntax you can use with the roll-up. Here we're using group by the fields with roll-up. You can also use group by roll-up and then include the fields in the parentheses, and it results in the exact same thing. So different syntax, same result. The cube operator is similar to the roll-up operator, except that it adds a summary row for every combination of groups. It also adds a summary row to the end of the result set that summarizes the entire result set. Since there's only one field in the group by, the result is exactly the same as for the roll-up operator. If the group by clause specifies a single group, only the final summary row is added. You probably won't be using the cube operator much, but at least now you know how it works. So here's another example of using it. Rollup will summarize by the vendor state, but the cube also summarizes it by vendor city. So cube just gives you a bunch more rollups. The grouping sets operator is similar to rollup and cube, but only includes summary rows. And we're not going to cover that. And this last one, you can look at it yourself. And that is it for Chapter 5.